Okay, I want to thank you all for coming to this evening's discussion. Tonight has been organized on the occasion of the opening last Friday of the exhibition Chance Aesthetics over at the Kemper Art Museum. And the show explores the use of chance as a key compositional principle in modern art, from the beginning of the 20th century to the early 1970s. My name is Meredith Malone. I'm the curator of the exhibition, and I will be the moderator of tonight's discussion. Before getting started, I'd just like to give you a brief introduction to the exhibition itself. I started this project about 2 years ago with the idea of putting together an exhibition that would look at the history of modern art through a slightly different lens. So while chance as accident has always been a part of artistic creation, it wasn't really until the beginning of the 20th century that artists began to adopt it as a decisive factor in the actual composition of a work of art. The exhibition sets out to uniquely investigate how the artistic implementation of chance and its many manifestations overtly challenged traditional assumptions about what might constitute a work of art, as well as the role of the artist in society. But at the project's heart is the central paradox involving the tension between chance and choice, between chance and artistic control. While many artists have championed the creative possibilities of chance, artistic subjectivity, in the end, is rarely ever seated in its entirety. In the context of this project, chance is understood as a relative concept, defined by an intentional curbing of artistic agency, not as an absolute absence of cause. So the artists presented in Chance Aesthetics engaged in a variety of chance-based practices. And tonight I've chosen just a few examples to present to you to provide a sense of sort of the wide-ranging processes that artists engaged in, whether through how artists engage chance, whether through external forces like gravity, as you can see in this slide here, I'm showing you work by Jackson Pollock, or artists who using natural processes of decay like Dieter Roth. And in both of these slides you can see Dieter Roth is a Swiss artist who used rotting food as his medium. In this case, he used a piece of sausage that he cut and let the oils of the sausage sort of ooze out to determine the composition. And in this case, he basically just smeared mayonnaise all over a piece of paper and let the decay ensue. Other artists turn not to external forces, but to internal forces, as exemplified in the surrealist automatic techniques, including automatic drawing, an example of which you see here on your left, and sand painting. You see one of André Masson's sand paintings here on the right. These practices were designed to bypass the conscious mind, tapping into the unconscious, and opening up new avenues of exploration of unexpected forms. Other artists still used found objects, items fortuitously happened upon, such as Jean Dubouffet's bearded head, which is just a piece of driftwood that he happened upon on the beaches in the Côte d'Azur. And Daniel Sperry's trap paintings, this piece on the right, where he would basically glue down everyday objects that he happened upon exactly to the surfaces on which he found them. In this case, something like his mother's junk drawer. Still, other artists, such as Jean Tinguely, turned to more overtly mechanical practices. This is one of Tinguely's metamatic machines, which were machines that he designed to sort of automatically create abstract drawings with just the touch of a button. And the final example that I just wanted to bring up this evening are those artists who use various randomizing systems to determine their compositional choices, including throwing dice, pulling numbers out of a hat, flipping coins, and in the case of this French artist, Francois Morellet, you see here, drawing random numbers out of a telephone book in order to come up with coordinates in what is otherwise a highly systematized abstraction. And I'd be happy in the discussion section. It's a little complicated to talk about exactly what he did here, but we can talk about it a little bit later. So, recognizing that the move to employ chance as a compositional factor did not occur in a vacuum, I also wanted to explore with this project the relationship between artistic production and the socio-cultural matrix in which it was made. Every age has its particular fascination with chance as origin, terminus, and possibility. In the early 20th century, psychologists, philosophers, scientists, and artists alike were enthralled by the notion of chance as a possible key to a non-deterministic scheme for interpreting the universe. In physics, this culminated in quantum theory and Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which together toppled deterministic constructs of the physical universe. In the realm of psychology, Carl Jung's theory of synchronicity and Sigmund Freud's interpretation of dreams and his notion of parapraxis or Freudian slips became for many artists a source of inspiration as accident began to appear as a means of discovery. With the rise of fascism in Europe in the 1930s, chance, accident, and play acquired a sharper political edge, while in the immediate post-World War II period, many artists embraced an aesthetic of spontaneity as a means of grappling with a civilization traumatized by the Holocaust and nuclear devastation. With the emergence of market research, risk management, game theory, and other forms of knowledge based on statistical surveys and probability in the 1950s and 60s, the random occurrence became the unpredictable exception that proved the predictable rule. While statistical thinking may have theoretically robbed chance of its power, artists on both sides of the Atlantic mobilized randomness and indeterminacy as a counterpoint to the rapid standardization and experience attributable to increases of consumerism and functionalism. So it's because of the multidisciplinary nature of chance aesthetics that I felt it was a perfect opportunity to bring together a group of professors from across fields in the university to discuss how chance and its various manifestations, including randomness, indeterminacy, probability, enter into and inform their own fields, including music, art, literature, architecture, and anthropology. So we have a terrific group of panel members joining us tonight. I'll introduce each one of them in the order of their appearance first. After each discussion, we'll have a group discussion with the panel, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A with the audience. And at 6:30, I'd like to invite everybody in the museum staying open late tonight to come over and see the exhibition, and also to enjoy a light reception. So, our first presenter is Herman Pontzer. Herman is an assistant professor of anthropology and the Harbison Faculty Fellow at Washington University. He studies human evolution and is particularly interested in the ways that evolution has shaped the anatomy and physiology of humans and other apes. He is also the director of the Human Evolutionary Biomechanics Laboratory. John Klein, John, just raise your hand maybe. No, thank you. John is the associate professor in the Department of Art History and Archaeology. He teaches courses in various aspects of modern and contemporary art in Europe and the US, including Dada and Surrealism, modern sculpture, public art, art criticism, and modern art and decoration. His publications focus on the late 19th and 20th century in Europe, with extensive work on the French artist Henri Matisse, including a book on Matisse's portraits. He is currently writing a book entitled Matisse's Late Decorations and the Essential Quality of Art. Our third presenter is Stamos Metzidakis. Stamos is a professor of French and comparative literature here at WashU. His research interests include modern French, Francophone, and comparative literature from the late 18th century to the present. Other research interests include visual, verbal relations between painting, sculpture, film, and literature. He is the author of the books Repetition and Semiotics, Interpreting Prose Poems from 1986, and Difference Unbound, The Rise of Pluralism in Literature and Criticism from 1995. He is currently working on 2 book manuscripts, including Recollecting French America, A Personal Chronology. Our fourth presenter is Bruce Durazzi. Bruce is the assistant professor in the Department of Music. His research interests include the theory and aesthetics of 20th century music, especially mid-century modernism and relationships between modern music and politics. His current work focuses on the music and politics of Luigi Nono, the subject of a book in progress. And our final presenter is Eric Mumford, the professor of architecture at Washington University, where he is also has joint appointments in the Department of History and Art History. He is the author of the Siam Discourse on Urbanism, 1928 to 1960, which came out in 2000, and the recent Defining Urban Design, Siam Architects and the Formation of the Discipline, which just came out this year. He's also the co-editor of Joseph Louis Serre, The Architecture of Urban Design, and Modern Architecture in St. Louis, Washington University, and Post-War American Architecture, 1948 to 1973. thank you all for being here. With that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Herman.
Good evening, and thanks to Meredith and Kemper for having this, the exhibition and also this panel. My name is Herman Pontzer. I'm a professor over in anthropology, and as a professor in anthropology, I focus on, like Meredith said, human evolution and other aspects of sort of anatomy and physiology as they relate to humans and other apes. So I'm particularly interested in biological processes, life sciences, and so I thought it would be most useful for me to talk about the way that chance and randomness sort of play a role in both the natural sciences themselves as well as in the way that the natural sciences are sort of conducted. So there's sort of three aspects that I think I want to focus on. I'm going to speak pretty briefly, so I'll be brief. The first, is this. The issue of identifying natural randomness. Right. So the world is a fuzzy, messy place. We've gotten to know more about that fuzz and mess over the last few centuries as science has sort of found its footing. And what we've realized over the last couple hundred years as scientists is that it's very easy to want to see patterns in what is really random sorts of events. And a great example of that is faces. So we actually know that the human brain has built into it, via evolution, a part of your brain that is dedicated to seeing faces. So we're all predisposed to try to find and recognize faces in what would otherwise be random just pictures. And so you can see there's a face here on Mars. Right? This is a picture of the Martian surface. And when this came out, it caused a stir because everybody wanted to know what a face was doing on Mars. And of course, I don't know that it really is a face. And we have the same thing here on a sort of smaller scale. It didn't come out quite as well, but this is, if you can't tell, it's because you're not looking hard enough. It's the likeness of Jesus on a grilled cheese. Also, a huge stir was caused with this. And when a scientist views this, if he's rigorous and careful, the thing you immediately are struck with is just the fact that random processes like frying a grilled cheese or the erosion processes that make planet landscapes can produce things that look to be patterned. And so we have a whole science of statistics built around basically testing our observations to make sure that we aren't looking at chance, to make sure that when we see a pattern or when we think we see a pattern, that we actually do, because we're so inclined to make sense of noise. And so that's certainly one part of how randomness affects the natural sciences is the sort of sense of always trying to keep it in its box and keep it locked away so it doesn't mess up our results and make us look silly. The second thing that's probably worth noting is the happy accident in science. So as science has taken off, and you've got more and more people doing more and more research in different laboratories all over the world, you end up having, just through the creative process of science, because of course science is a creative process, unexpected results that can't be explained any better than by saying they're just random chance results. A good example of that is radar. Radar was developed by the British, I think in World War II, to try to create an energy beam that would take down German planes. And what they realized was that sort of energy isn't very useful for taking down planes, but it's pretty good for letting you know where they are. And radar was born. Silly putty is one outcome of people trying to make C4 explosives. Super glue was originally invented as an adhesive for putting people's eyes back together. Penicillin was found by accident, as we all know, through mold. So there are, in the history of science, a lot of these cases of just chance events that change really the course of what we know about the natural world and how we do our work. But finally, I want to focus on, maybe slightly more in depth, on this issue of chance in the natural world. And fundamentally, chance drives what we know to be the unifying framework of the natural world, and that is evolution. We know that all the living things that we see in the world today are products of evolution. And we often think about natural selection when we think about evolution, but there's a randomness, a random component to evolution as well, and that is the creation of new variations through mutation. Mutation of the DNA, which creates variation, is absolutely necessary and is the prime provider of variation that natural selection can work on. And so natural selection gives us these sort of differences that we see when we look at Jane Goodall and her friend here. But those vast differences aren't possible if there isn't variation to work on. And so, if we can think about a population of folks that are all the same, mutation tends to create variance there. And it's those variants that natural selection has to work from, and there we go. Natural selection can sort of end up choosing one of those variants, and you see more of that variant in the next generation. And so it becomes this iterative process of mutation and natural selection that allow us to have these big changes over time. And I think that one of the things that we'll probably end up talking about in this panel is that this process is analogous in some ways to the random processes that artists were using in some of the pieces in the exhibition, and then the selective process that the artists were also using to sort of decide what they wanted to keep and show. And with that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
John?
I'm John Klein, in art history and archaeology. And my thanks also to Meredith for the exhibition and the opportunity to have this panel. It's a terrific exhibition. You really should all go see it. There's some quite striking things in it, including that wonderful pour thing by William Anastasia. My field is closest to the subject of the exhibition, but I will strive not to say too much that the exhibition can tell you or that the catalog can tell you. And I want to focus instead, are we all in the same presentation here?
Yes, going forward.
All right. Oops, and naturally we're blocking the captions, but you know what this is. I want to focus on two axes, you might say, a strong axis and then what might be a weak axis. And the strong axis is the relationship between chance and the machine. Two things that you might think are diametrically opposed to one another, but in fact I think are very strongly linked. And this is implied in many places in the exhibition, in the work by Jean Tinguely, for instance, the metamatic machine, or not actually as it shows, but what some of the drawings are. And the weak axis is an axis that connects chance and randomness. And I don't have anything profound to say about that, but it might arise into discussion because I think the difference between them might be instructive, and I'll suggest a difference between them which I don't take to be definitive. This is an example of one of the archetypes of chance operations early in the 20th century. It's not in the exhibition, but a different work by art is. And it's easy to question whether or not this was actually made by chance, since it seems so composed, despite the title, despite what art tells us. And it reminds us of a slightly earlier evocation of the importance of chance, and that is the poem by Stéphane Mallarmé from 1897, I think, called "A Roll of the Dice Will Never Abolish Chance." And you scratch your head about that for a minute, but what is going on there is, it seems to be a contrast between randomness and chance. That is, a roll of the dice has 6 possibilities. A flip of the coin has 2. And the results are randomized, but they're within a distinct set of possibilities. Whereas chance seems to me to be more open-ended, more open to almost infinite possibility. And I think this will become a little clearer what I mean by this distinction in the realm of art in a moment. But this is one of those claims by an early 20th century Dada artist that he was relinquishing conscious control and setting his compositional principle according to a kind of chance occurrence, or the alliance of gravity and chance and the breeze in the air and so forth. And another classic in this respect, and represented in the exhibition, is Marcel Duchamp's 3 standard stoppages, in which he took a meter length of string and held that straight and dropped it on the floor, or onto a canvas actually, from a height of 1 meter, and then recorded the configuration that the string made, and did this 3 times, and made templates of these occurrences so that he would have founded a new system of measurement. He called this canned chance. He called this idea canned chance. So this already introduces the way in which a set of rules interacts with chance occurrences to create something new. And I think this interaction, this canned chance, is central to the concept of the exhibition. And it introduces into a rational discourse, that is measurement, a new chance occurrence. That is, he's remaking the meter. The meter, after all, which was, the meter was in Paris at the International Bureau of Weights and Standards, that iron bar with 2 marks on it, replaced not so long before this time by a platinum iridium bar with new marks and ever more precise. Now we have a cesium clock to measure the interval of the meter. But making something ludicrous in comparison to one of the ultra-rational things that helps to measure the world and the foundation of a whole system of measuring and ordering the world is very deliberately Duchamp's goal here, to mess with that history and tradition of order and measurement. And the First World War produced a considerable interest in the effects of machines in modern life, both for and against, both salutary and destructive. The First World War was an enormously destructive event, a cataclysm, in which war for the first time was highly mechanized and could be conducted at a distance by devices of one kind or another. And the intersection of the mechanism and the human is a very common theme in this period. The way in which the machine is humanized and the human is turned into the mechanical. So chance and the mechanical or machine culture are both extremely important elements of early 20th century artistic expression. And I think we can characterize these as constructive. I don't mean constructive like positive constructive, but constructed or assembled. You're laying one thing on top of another or adding one thing to another. That's how mechanisms, after all, are constructed as well. You're adding one thing to another. It's an artifact of an era of manufacturing. And the science and the use of chance are very much oriented toward this world of manufacturing in this period. And I think a shift occurs with something like this work of art. Something like it is represented in the exhibition. This is one of Ellsworth Kelly's squares arranged, or spectrum colors arranged by chance, in which he combined the grid and some rules and some random events in the effort to create a composition. Now the grid itself, this is also something maybe interesting to talk about, perhaps especially with respect to music, the idea of a staff is a kind of grid. The intersection of the grid and chance is quite interesting. Here is a kind of collaboration between the grid, a kind of ultra-rational composition, a collaboration between the grid and chance, connected with a set of instructions for how to go about making this composition. So, as with so many things in the exhibition here, chance is employed in concert with conscious decision. Rule-making, after all, is agency. And so making the rules that you follow when you're doing things by chance is itself a form of composition or a form of willful arrangement. And I want to discern a shift then. And that shift is away from the idea of creation and manufacture and our individual artistic agency toward a concern with systems, toward a concern with economic and social and natural systems in the arts as well as in other fields of endeavor. And I have here for an example Vito Acconci's Following piece from 1969. Some of you may know what Acconci was up to here. He wrote a set of instructions for himself about his behavior during a specified period of time. He would go out into the street in Greenwich Village, where he lived, and or Soho rather, and he would start following the first person whom he saw, and he would follow that person until that person went into a private place, and he couldn't go in anymore. And then he would do the same thing the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and then record the results. Well, in writing a set of instructions for himself, which can take the form of if-then statements. If a person comes along, I will follow her. If she goes into a building, I will stop following her. If-then statements are the fundamental form of an algorithm, and an algorithm is the set of instructions for a computer. And this, it seems to me, leads us to the current, I think we can still think of ourselves as being in the current phase of interest in systems and instructions and divergence into infinite possibility. This is a work of art by the Japanese conceptual artist Tatsuo Miyajima, one of his many deployments of LED light counters, ganged together in large groups so that their function becomes randomized. The LED counter goes from 0 to 9 and back to 0 and back to 9 and over and over and over again, highly rational, highly measured, highly ordered, but then he gangs them together with an ultimate controller that ensures a randomness to the numbers that eventually emerge. And it should remind us that the creation of large random numbers can be done only by computer, only through using one of the most highly rationalized, technically sophisticated devices available to us, can we achieve true randomness. That's all I said.
Stamos?
Thank you, Meredith, and thank you, John.
That's all right, I'll turn this.
Okay. I recognize several of the ideas that John and I expressed in a course that we taught on Dada and Surrealism a few years ago, so it's nice to revisit some of this material. Chance in literature. I wrote down several names and texts and dates, so I'm going to try to give you a rapid history, basically, over the last 200 years. Basically, the tradition in literature is against chance. That is to say, the vast history of literature is against chance. Imitation is the key concept in literary history up till the end of the 18th century, basically up until Romanticism. So if you imitate the classic models, obviously you're not doing anything random. You're doing something very systematic and rule-governed. But the romantic cult of genius and inspiration sort of changes all of that. Can you hear me?
Yeah. I'm going to give this mic.
So Romanticism basically comes about as a result of socio-political events as well as aesthetic events. You know that Romanticism is pretty much keenly linked to the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and any number of other social revolutions. And what happens with Romanticism in literature is that whatever ideas or thoughts or feelings one has naturally come to be prized in literary text as signs of one's individuality, of one's originality. That's pretty much what Rousseau is all about. You bare your soul, and as a result, people are going to know you better, and it is these kind of haphazard feelings and thoughts and ideas that you express that indicate your humanity, as it were. So the control of work through reason and logic gives way to kind of uncontrolled effusiveness or emotionality, even fantasy. Again, you think of Rousseau, you think of Goethe here, think of Macpherson's mock texts, epic texts of Ocean, think of Sir Walter Scott. So imagination takes over basically for imitation. And imagination moves in random directions, comes to supplant imitation. Quoting William Blake here, to cast aside from poetry all that is not inspiration. That basically was his goal. Now, the modern city also becomes the kind of locus of chance encounters rather than the familiar, comfortable, unchanging world of the countryside or even that of the royal court in literature. So you have this socio-political move away from the monarchy to democracy that is then translated into literature by the infusion of newer, less known character types. I'm referring here to the character types of criminals, capitalists, madmen, poor people, and adulteresses, among many other social types That's pretty much a random list, by the way. I think here of Balzac's Human Comedy, which supplants, obviously, Dante's Divine Comedy. You think of Dickens here, talking about certain social types that you were never talked about before. Think of Madame Bovary, Flaubert's text. Think of Hugo, of course, Victor Hugo's Misérables, Les Mis, as they now call it, unfortunately. These are all texts that obviously deal with characters of the modern world who seem to be acting in random ways, in random fashions. They're not predictable. They're scary as a result. A lot of times they're scary. Baudelaire now comes along and finds poetic inspiration, for instance, in the chance meeting of people at street corners. He talks about this in his prose poem collections. So rather than look for a proper theme in some deliberate fashion, Baudelaire and other symbolists start basically giving away the control of the work to the work itself. Mallarmé, who's mentioned before, actually dreams of a work in which the elocutionary presence of the narrator disappears once and for all. In other words, giving way to the words, the power of the words themselves to say or do whatever they want to do. Do we have this here? Yes. So he writes this incredible poem called Un coup de dé, a throw of dice, which is composed, as you can see, in what appears to be a random fashion. You have words all over the page, going in with different typescripts, going in different directions, to the point where we're not really sure how to read this. Do we read from left to right? Do we read, from top to the bottom? Or are we given a kind of passport to total freedom in our decipherment of this type of text? Mallarmé's goal was also to produce a work of art that was actually similar to a musical score, which was also mentioned here a little while ago, so that these sheets of paper on which this poem is printed were meant to be presented a bit like a musical score. Okay, a couple of more comments about symbolism. Symbolism itself, which is a late 19th century phenomenon, opens the door even wider to the randomness of the unconscious. As you all know, Charcot, Freud are writing and studying various psychic phenomena and are beginning to write about them, especially Freud at the end of the 19th century. And his work on hysteria points to a huge inner psychic world that seems to function not in any coherent manner, but in a haphazard way. Obviously, that's very much what his psychoanalytic theory is, in a sense, designed to tame. We want to tame this crazy unconscious that we don't have any control over. But by the same token, symbolism seems to want to tap into that. Let it speak however it wants to speak. And this symbolist movement will give rise to, will generate texts like Ubu the King, Ubu Roi by Jarry, considered to be the kind of forerunner of the theater of the absurd in the 20th century, where you have this bombastic, absurd, ridiculously disgusting protagonist named Ubu, who goes around basically dropping people through trap doors and making grand pronouncements that don't make any sense, who is, in a sense, an embodiment of the id itself, if one might say that. Lautréamont, of course, is another name that comes to mind here. 1874 author of the Song of Mildred, who was a great inspiration to the Surrealists in the 20th century. He was basically unknown in his own time and was rediscovered by André Breton and the Surrealist circles in the early 1920s. Lautréamont is very often quoted for his definition or for his image, which leads to a surrealist definition of what the poetic image is. His image is that of a, quote, fortuitous encounter on a dissecting table of an umbrella and a and a sewing machine. That's the thing, sewing machine. This random encounter on the dissecting table is thought by Breton and company to be an absolutely magnificent example of what poetic images can be. But you see that they're based totally on randomness. The Surrealists, of course, we've already heard this. Surrealists and the Dadaists basically are going to base large parts of their entire poetic theories and practices on fortuitous verbal acts. Automatic writing, of course, is the most obvious example, where you don't have any preconceived notion of what you're going to say or write, but you just start writing. Stream of consciousness is a kind of variation of that in Joyce and elsewhere. Last comment real quickly here. I mentioned the theater of the absurd, but if you think about randomness in the latter part of the 20th century, or mid to the latter part of the 20th century, you can think of people like Pirandello, right? 6 characters in search of an author. There's a kind of a great drive towards allowing characters to do whatever they want. I think of Jerzy Kosinski's novel Being There, whose protagonist, as you may recall, is actually named Chance, and through a whole series of chance events becomes known as Chauncey Gardner, rather than his original name Chance. So the whole idea of chance in literature basically takes off at the end of the 18th century and becomes, I would say, part and parcel of the main tools available to literary artists.
I'm Bruce Durazzi, and I'm in music, and I'm afraid I don't have media to present. Not because there's not a great deal of it available, but because if I began to scratch the surface, I would need several hours more than my allotted 5 minutes. It's because there are so many interesting ways that chance and its related phenomena affect music. So I'd like to focus more than anything else on one central character in music, and that is John Cage. And he has few precedents, really, and it's almost out of nowhere in the middle of the century with these striking new propositions about how music can be put together. And he begins in some ways with highly rationalized procedures from the generation before of sort of lining up. You line up all your variables in some kind of grid, even prior to the musical stack. It's an abstract grid where you just list all of the things you're allowed to do, either individual notes or kinds of gestures. And then you have procedures. Right? This is sort of, it's a way of describing something like the 12-tone method of composing from the generation before. You have procedures, and then those control your work to some degree as you go through and make choices. And Cage just decided that it would be better not to make choices, for reasons having to do with his own peculiar modernist sensibility, and also with his own even more peculiar understanding of Zen Buddhism. He thought that music was a good way to train your mind to appreciate sounds as sounds in themselves, that everyday sounds should be musical. So composition, for him, he sort of exactly turned inside out what most composers, or most people think of writing music as doing. So instead of trying to find sounds that are beautiful and communicative, he was trying to find ways of neutralizing sounds so that you listen to them just as sounds. So he would make charts with all of his available materials, and importantly, in beginning around 1950 and in 1951, with music of changes, he started flipping coins, and he would toss a coin in order to decide what sound to put next, and toss it again, toss the coin again to decide how long it should be, and toss the coin again to decide how loud it should be, and then toss the coin again to decide how to get on to the next thing. And in order to write a single note in the score, he had to toss a coin at least 18 times. Because he had these 8x8 charts, so there are 64 possibilities of sound, 64 possibilities of dynamic level, 64 possibilities of rhythmic proportion. At one point during this process, he wrote a letter to someone. This is so good, I have to quote it verbatim. He's writing a letter to a friend and apologizing for not writing well. He says, "You must realize that I spend a great deal of time tossing coins. And the emptiness of head that induces begins to penetrate the rest of my time as well." But this is the desired effect for Cage, that he's sort of neutralizing subjective decisions, right? He's just tossing coins. And the result of this process is a traditional score, right? It's written, the music is written on a musical staff, and the player has instructions about how to follow it. You read it from left to right, you start at the beginning, you play to the end. The score predicts what notes will be played at what time. And then that sort of bothered him. He thought that was still too deterministic, that the material in the charts was based on his own decisions too much, and he wasn't getting to that Zen ideal of sort of how to say it, undetermined mindfulness of the moment. So he used the same procedures a few years later to write his imaginary landscape number 4. So he tossed coins to decide how long each event would be and which event would happen at what time and allowed. But the events themselves were radios tuned to randomly chosen frequencies. So there are, I think, 14 radios in the ensemble, if I remember right. And the players, there's a conductor, and the players have instructions about where to turn the dials on their radios off and on throughout the performance. And the content, what you actually hear, a lot of it's going to be static, it's going to be random bits of whatever happens to be on, and that's the content for the piece. Not long after this, Cage gets to the idea that he's given himself a great deal of, or he's achieved a great deal of liberation for himself by using these chant procedures to write his music. But it's not fair to the performers that they're constrained to perform exactly what he wrote. So he starts looking for ways of fixing less and making his finished works less and less specific. And so what was aleatory or chance, random-driven decision-making becomes indeterminacy, sort of this great bleed from chance to indeterminacy in music, where composers are writing scores of one sort or another that just are much less specific than you expect, and in varying degrees. And some of them say things like, the players should gather on the stage and play some sounds that seem musical until the audience seems satisfied. I'm paraphrasing. And others are somewhat more specific in different respects, but somehow the players are given instructions that determine less than everything that they're accustomed to expecting. The players have to make decisions. Finally, well, not finally by any means, but one more thing that I'd like to observe before we pass the microphone along is later composers, following from these principles, are looking for varying degrees or ways of exploring the boundary between decision-making and freedom. Get into stochastic processes of one sort or another, where you have a highly deterministic grid and some probabilistic way of moving through the decisions. For those of you who know, Yannis Xenakis is a musician who used this principle a lot. So that there's a kind of randomness at the level of small detail in the score, but he has some idea of what the big shape is going to be. And so here, this is a kind of chance procedure used to generate material, but not in a sense of, or not with the ultimate goal of giving up control over it, but rather of controlling the broad gesture and leaving the details of the chance. And that's about as much as I have time for. So that's some of the ways that chance has influenced the composition of music.
Okay. If the Philippians, maybe that's what we're doing. Yeah, right. Thanks. Yeah, okay. Far away. How's it? Is that good? I was going to talk a little bit about architecture and chance, which Meredith had asked for, and so thank her for the invitation. It's a difficult topic because architecture is in a way not about chance at all. It's really against chance. In fact, architects hate things, the random elements that always interrupt the project. And it's not just aesthetic preference. That's why there are a lot of major decisions involved in buildings, and especially in sort of urban systems. And so you don't necessarily want a lot of chance to intrude. So that in a way could be the whole thing. But in terms of the exhibit itself, it seemed like specifically some modernist aspects of dealing with chance in architecture were worth noting, especially because there's some fairly direct links, not only between the Chance Aesthetic show, but also between the other shows at Metabolic City. So it's kind of a way to connect you, to some extent, to the material on exhibit. And a key figure in all of that, of course, is Le Corbusier, who certainly has affinities also to some of the ideas the other panelists were mentioning. He was very much influenced early on by Duchamp and Surrealism. And so his kind of, what we today see as almost maniacal ideas of order, were in some ways a kind of effort to reconstitute a new order after the breakdown of World War I and of the classical system, one could say, which was very much connected to a lot of other things, aristocracy and monarchy and so on. And so that, in a way, it's a very brief moment, really, where Le Corbusier dominates architecture in the 1940s and 50s. And there's this kind of effort to not exactly include chance completely, but as I'll talk about in a minute, with people like Allison and Peter Smithson, who start out as kind of proteges almost of Le Corbusier, there's a certain amount of chance that's introduced. But it's very much within this framework of kind of Corbusian order. And he often talked about the poetry of classification, the Siam grid, which was set up in the late 1940s as a way of organizing the presentation of modernist urban projects at the regular congresses of the International Congress of Modern Architecture, was a kind of effort to find some sort of poetry of classification, which I think in a certain way does relate to the material of the show, even though it was all about trying to eliminate chance. In a way. And in that way, it has a lot of connections to various other modernist systems of order, which often take things that are sort of disorderly or even random and then try to organize them into new systems of design. And obviously, a lot of that then has many implications in the post-war period, which I won't try to go into, but the whole aspects of cybernetics, of various systems of control that eventually arrive at computing and the internet, all of that comes out of the same atmosphere, really, of the war and post-war years. And much of it, I think, related very strongly to wartime efforts, things like radar and some of the things that were already mentioned, that those have all these, and I think continuing kinds of implications on all different aspects of not just art, but really of modern culture and civilization generally. But of course, what we're also familiar with in terms of modern architecture is the rejection of it, really beginning in the 50s as a kind of internal revolt against the leadership of people like Le Corbusier and Walter Gropius, who, although hailed as avant-garde heroes in the 20s, by the 50s were beginning to seem kind of stale and, in fact, sort of oppressive kinds of characters. And so the group like Team 10 emerges out of Siam. And people like Allison and Peter Smithson are very important. And they were quite aware of Jackson Pollock and Jean Dubuffet, and that's really where you have the closest point of affinity. Interestingly, I think, again, to both shows across the plaza, that there's this kind of linkage between these methods of someone like Pollock and at least their rhetoric in architecture, whether it could really ever work to design whole cities in a random kind of way, an open-ended sort of as-found kinds of ideas, I think is a question. And I think that the relative absence of built projects of this kind is not exactly accidental. There are some, but they typically end up not to be as successful as their protagonists had hoped. There also is in the Smithson's rhetoric this appropriation of the slum photographs of Nigel Henderson, an English photographer who went out into the streets of the East End of London and photographed sort of everyday life. And this famous grid from Siam 9 of Allison and Peter Smithson is really a kind of direct critique of Le Corbusier and the Siam grid. And instead of taking the categories of Corbusian modernism, they instead proposed another set of categories, the familiar house, street, and city. And they also take half of the grid, the side on your left, and use the Henderson photographs instead of architectural drawings or the kinds of statistical materials that would have been expected at a Siam Congress. And so that was quite a radical rhetorical gesture, kind of the beginning of the whole atmosphere of revolt of the 50s, which then, of course, really comes to fruition in the 1960s. And I think, that, and again, it's not exactly chance in design, but it's this kind of valorization of the non-authoritarian, of the anti-design in a way that really starts to take hold as part of architectural culture. And I think still is an important element, really, in architectural culture today. Again, there aren't a lot of built projects, though, and sometimes you wonder if the Smithsonian's projects like this one for East Berlin had actually been carried out, whether the results really would have been as great as would have argued at the time. There also, again, this aspect of cybernetics and kind of control, this whole issue of chaos, urban chaos needing to come under control, remaining a preoccupation, not just of architects, but a lot of other areas of culture in the post-war period. And you get phenomena like American metropolitan areas, which are a weird combination of the random and the controlled, but they're highly controlled in certain ways, and yet in other ways not designed in the architectural sense. And so again, that's a kind of aspect of chance there, but it's whether it's something that relates to the kind of chance that artists were looking for, someone like John Cage, I think is a question. In any event, we all know that by the late 60s, there was a huge reaction against this kind of master plan control, much of it focusing on architects, although really I think its targets were even broader than just designers or Peruvian architects themselves. And out of that, you get a new sort of cultural landscape after the 60s, one of protest and resistance, really, to these any idea of master planning or control. A lot of that actually leading to a certain valorization of self-build, of kind of informal settlements that happen in Latin America and other parts of the world, and at the same time, a kind of emergent ecological approach, which again is all about eliminating chance and is all about entirely about control, matrices, systems of organization, where someone like Ian McHarg in the late 60s plays a very important role in developing approaches that are still very much a part of design today. So in terms of architecture, the outcomes of all of this are really quite uncertain and remain that way, that there's still this kind of rhetorical opposition between modern and traditional now, but both really involving highly controlled ways of doing things, and only very occasionally are elements of chance introduced. One fairly difficult to find example is this Enrique Moraes market in Barcelona, where a fire of the 19th century market in the center of the old city led to a renovation project where there's really an effort to kind of take the random or as-found elements of the old city and make those design elements in the new design. But nonetheless, it's a very controlled effort. It's hard to say this is really chance in the same sense of the things that you see in the show. And similarly, things like the Minneapolis waterfront, where an exploded warehouse was then kind of reconstructed as part of the waterfront design there, next to Jean Nouvel's Guthrie Theater. Again, it's hard to say this is really a design method for chance, but it certainly is an example of how chance can be used in architecture. So, thank you.
Well, thank you to all of you for some great, stimulating presentations. I'd like to kick off the discussion by just asking a few questions of the panel, and then we'll open it up in a few minutes to the audience as well. So I thought maybe, since we're talking about a range of practices here and a range of different fields, maybe one way that we could enter into a larger discussion here is to kind of go back and maybe define some of these terms that we're talking about. John brought this up at first. We're talking about chance and probability and randomness, and all of these things seem like interchangeable terms, but I wonder if we can delve a little bit deeper into their relationship between chance and randomness. I mean, and how that does kind of shift the meaning that is assigned to these practices as well.
You didn't invite him out,
I know. Well, I tried. Does anybody want to delve into it? I mean, we don't have to define them exactly, but there's a difference between chance, if you want to think about it, as complete arbitrariness, and then there's rare instances where we're really talking about that idea. It's more, at least in Cage, there's this kind of idea. It's more about randomness within these kind of controlled parameters.
I think randomness implies control parameters.
Mm-hmm.
From the science point of view, maybe you would say randomness is the way systems behave when they fall along something like a bell curve, where there's an average, and then there's some amount of, some degree of spread on each side. There isn't a science, well, there's a natural science definition of chance that I can think of, but maybe you would think about chance as something that, if we were to think about discussions of chance in science, it would probably be the kind of collisions of different systems, environment versus different species, species coming together with sort of chance events, rather than maybe randomness of drawing DNA sequences from a hat. So, I don't know.
Isn't chance more closely aligned with accident than with randomness?
Yeah.
And we use the term aleatory composition, or it's used by Cage and others. And that implies chance and accident as well, rather than randomness, I think. Or is it elided and not really specified?
In music, I don't know if we make the distinction much. There are some fine-grained distinctions to make. I mean, etymologically, aleatory comes from alia, meaning dice, so it refers to dice games, which suggests randomness within very controlled parameters. If we take chance to mean something more like natural phenomena, where there's no real, where there is no framework, I can't think of many musical projects where the undertaking is quite that wide open. So probably something, I mean, as we're developing our terms here, something more like randomness is what we're talking about when we speak of chance in music.
If I might make the distinction in a similar manner. With regard to literature, I think about how the word aleatory is used in surrealist circles, that the early surrealists liked to basically walk at random in flea markets and places like that, sort of obscure places in Paris, and start to see what would happen, what they would discover. And they called those movements aleatory movements. So there were no, I guess you could say there were really no parameters in a sense, other than the fact that they would get off at a certain metro stop and go to a place that was known for its mysterious atmosphere.
All of which not to be discounted too much.
Right. I suppose that's true. Whereas randomness in literature reminds me of what was done by an experimental group of writers called the Oulipo writers, who basically came up with algorithms and other kinds of mathematical symbols in order to produce works based on certain formulaic arrangements. That is, they had no idea, again, what they were going to produce, but they had this formula ahead of time, and so whatever words sort of fit in to those patterns would become the basis for a work of art. I mean, one of the most famous examples of this is George Perec's novel called The Disappearance, which is an enormous lipogram, which is a 250-page novel composed of words, none of which have the letter E in it. So how can you do that? How could you write a 250-page novel in French and do that? It's a pretty random event.
It does seem like with all of these sort of areas that we're talking about, that chance or even randomness enters in as part of the system of order, and that's I think really as much what it's about in a sense, is that there's this highly structured environment of one sort or another, and then there's this effort to somehow problematize that through chance operations, sometimes in a very controlled way, sometimes not. And I think for architects, that's been some of the fascination, when there has been a fascination with chance, is trying to find ways to, again, defamiliarize, create some kind of new experience, new environment that didn't exist previously. But in fact, I think that it's quite difficult to do that in architecture, that even those strategies of defamiliarization become very predictable.
Just I wondered how you would put Frank Gehry's work that is sort of playful and
right. No, that's right. Right, it's playful, but at the same time highly controlled. So it's a kind of, I think it's very much like strategies in music, where there are efforts to create the effect of, wild activity or disorder, but really in fact they have to be really structured. And Kemper is a big innovator in the use of computers and design because of build those buildings. So while they may appear this wild explosion of some sort, they're in fact super controlled. So I think that's usually the case with architecture.
Same would be true for Calatrava.
Oh, exactly, yeah. No. I mean, just structurally, you can't really have random operations.
Well, it refers to what John was saying. It takes the growth of computers to be able to handle, get your hands on randomness at that scale and be able to produce something.
Yeah. It's more the appeal, I think, of something that goes outside of the norm, and that remains very strong.
But that does play into a question that I started thinking when John put up the image of Elder Kelly. It is this relation between system and control, but I know at least for a lot of artists, they kind of come up against this issue of how do you actually visualize randomness then? For Kelly, which is where this idea of, the grid sort of starts to come in. You have this sort of stable structure that then you can sort of play off against it in order to make it clear that this is a random system.
Yeah, and is this on now? No?
Yes.
It was. And now it is again, yes, okay. Yeah, if you listen to Rosalind Krauss, as I do from time to time, the grid is, in modern art, is precisely a non-compositional strategy, is a way of denying arrangement and denying artistic agency, a way of fostering not randomness, but the loss of control. And all of these things are intended as a kind of anti-romantic loss of individualism, to subsume the individual within a system or a set of rules or some other sort of order that is not individually generated. But in the end, or in the beginning, it is individually generated, and then in order to the control be relinquished.
And it often seems like it's part of an effort to create a sort of an illusion of science, I would say, for modern architects at least. Without necessarily really being scientific, there is this kind of idea that it's very objective, and which of course becomes the problem with it at a certain point.
Yeah, this is huge in music. I mean, Cage insisted on describing his practice as experimental music. So the idea was that by removing his agency from the decision making, that he was discovering possibilities of sound that the subjective mind wouldn't have discovered. And he always said things like, we hear so much music that we can't hear anything at all, because we're not listening to the sounds, we're listening to music as this symbolic system. So neutralizing that and coming up with possibilities that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise. A lot of it gets couched in pseudoscientific language.
Yeah, that's certainly true of all those colors. Color is not an attribute of things, not a part of representation, but you just regard the colors in and of themselves, and they're neutral. The one is just as good as another. They don't have value in that sense.
And I have one more question before we open it up to the panel, and this might be moving in a direction all are not necessarily comfortable with, but John, you brought in a contemporary example from 1992, and I wonder if the panel could discuss a little bit about how, this show is very much steeped in the modernist tradition. I specifically cut the show off in the early 1970s before the kind of the full-on postmodern shift, but I wonder if you have any thoughts about how chance still plays a role in either contemporary art or contemporary music, contemporary literature, architecture, science.
Well, that one was easy in science, I think. In the last 10 or so years, maybe more like 30 years, I don't know. There's been a movement in behavioral work and in other natural sciences as well to think about environment and random factors as producing the traits that we all see, the behaviors we see, or even physical traits in the animals and plants and that kind of thing. And it's gone to this point of sort of trying to deny any kind of natural structure and sort of determinism, genetic determinism especially, in having any kind of a real effect or pattern effect on behaviors and that kind of thing. And so, and I would wonder actually if that kind of parallels the growth of postmodernism, this idea that we can't predict behaviors because all behaviors are random acts that are so intricately involved in the randomness of the environment that there is no underlying structure. So that view of behavior versus what I think is coming around now, maybe sort of did in the 70s and was rejected, but is coming back, which is this idea of behaviors or preferences or that kind of thing as having some biological component and having some determinism, not fully ever, but some amount of that.
I think in architecture, other than the examples that I showed, there's a lot of interest now, I think, in recycling and reuse, and that can introduce an element of something like chance, that you happen to find a particular kind of window or something, and then that becomes a chance element. But it's always within a very controlled framework.
I can't think of specific examples in recent work of a strong engagement with the idea of chance. I think it's always there. Any artists who collaborate, any artists who use an external system, any artists who write a set of instructions that involves something that they don't have control over, anything like that. And there are many, many examples of which I cannot think of a single one right now, of one or more of these elements. But I tend to think that a time has passed. There was a moment, a long moment, when chance really seemed like an alternative to heroic individualism or the romantic idea of the artist, or the idea that the artist is always creating something.
I think there are some particularly interesting things going on in music right now, and the examples I can think of all have to do with technology in one way or another. That composers who are working, or performers who are working with synthesizers or computers, one kind or another, will introduce elements of randomness now and now. I can't remember the name of the group. It slips my mind. It's this performing ensemble that does this wonderful thing where they have the computer chips, and they an array of tiny little computer chips, and the performance consists of wiring them for sound into speakers on the stage. And actually, they perform with a soldering gun. Actually, and sort of put the chips together as the audience watches, and they create circuits while they watch. And in some cases, they don't know exactly. There's some randomness in how these pieces interact. They don't have them programmed necessarily to do specific things, and they just start soldering them together to see how it comes out. So that's a particularly fun example to see these performances. But one way or the other, a lot of, some number of performers are working with randomness or chance by having computers produce things that are not otherwise predictable.
But Cage actually started using computers, right?
Yes, Cage used computers. So he did a number of things. He used computers. He used electronic. There's no piece that just where you have a number of just the sort of everyday. You use everyday things you found. Sort of the little cartridges from old LP players, phonographs, and had a number of little cartridges wired up for sound, and there are instructions about how you drop them next to one another on the phone to accept the sounds that they produce.
Okay, we have about another 20 minutes left. I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience at this point.
I wonder, in terms of architecture, that particular problem, if you could turn it around and not be based on the creative act or the making of the architecture, but on the experience of the visitor and how the architecture can open up chance that way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's goes back really to the picturesque in the 18th century, and the idea of the experience being really the primary thing more than the design. It's all about the emotional associations and so on. And that remains, I think, a strong current, certainly in architecture, but usually to achieve those results, the process is a very controlled one. Chance seldom, as far as I can tell, enters into it. But yeah, from the experiential side, certainly, that's a major reason.
Yeah, and this reminds me of evolutions in exhibition design, for instance, or indeed museum design, the design of spaces in which people look at art, away from the prescriptive path and toward the multiple opportunity, not random, not chance, but at least a kind of set of if-then statements. If you go this way, then you'll see this, and then you'll see something else. And you'll see it in a different way because you saw something in a different sequence than you might have if you'd been led through by the nose in an older system of arranging such spaces.
In terms of literature, obviously you think of hypertext as a sort of modern or really contemporary experimentation with randomness and or chance. Just how is the novel going to finish? What's the next scene? It's basically left up to the reader to play around and do what he or she wants to do with the entire narration and the entire plot. So obviously these are multiple experiments that we find all over the place now.
And they're aspects of reception, not production,
Right.
and which accords with still contemporary interest in reception theory and the construction of meaning by the audience and so forth.
Yeah, I think John was right too when he pointed out that this business of chance may have seen its moment, and we're past it in a way now. I think of Roland Barthes' famous idea of the death of the author, just all the way back in the 1960s, now 1968, I believe, the essay appeared, and there was such a reaction against that. The author has come back in literary circles, big time, such that the author, I think, exerts that much more control over the work than she used to for this period when chance and randomness seemed to be reigning triumphant.
And just as another comment, though, in artistic circles too, certainly in like the late 50s and the 60s, this notion of artists creating sort of environmental spaces based on the idea of the labyrinth comes up over and over and over again. Certainly with Constant in the Metabolic City show, as well as Archigram. They did this, what's the Invisible, no. They did an exhibition and it was based on this notion of the labyrinth in the 1960s. The New Realists did this exhibition in 1960 called the Durazzi, which means Dynamic Labyrinth, in 1962. The whole idea is that you have these unprescribed paths that sort of break you as a visitor of your visual and habits and kind of traditional notions of what art and what the experience of art can be. So.
Yeah, in fact, I think it's, you mentioned surrealists were doing those kinds of things earlier on, and then there was also this kind of fascination with the classical past, or the pre-classical past in the 50s, and so someone like Sert at the Fondation Mag used the idea of the Palace of Knossos and the labyrinth as the organizing device. So it was a major reapplication for those historical period.
I guess some of the things that I had a couple of questions and kind of trying to assemble them in my head, which one I would ask. I guess in regards to architecture, and as you were saying, it's installation or museum spaces or things like this, Kurt Schwitter's came up, and Merzbow, that it was this chance object and this random collection of things that were being installed into his own house, and then his space was changing around that. And then I started thinking of Gregor Schneider's House of Art, where there's this whole like chance where you're moving through it and you don't really know what the spaces are doing, or you're sitting in the coffee room and all of a sudden can't get out because the door is closed because it's circling around. And so I think there is instances where that kind of line is crossing. But I guess my question would be, Rancière says that poetry is poetry as long as prose is confused for poetry. And so how much is it the tension between the randomness and the chance, or between the everyday, we're assimilating pattern to it, and the chance that makes chance aesthetics more essential or more unique in and of itself? Is that making any sense?
Well, survival is dependent on pattern recognition. And so maybe our desire to not have patterns is a form of elective pleasure that's not connected to survival precisely. Efforts to order and systematize and so forth are all survival strategies of one kind or another. And the delight and what was another word you used? I don't remember. The cage. Well, it doesn't matter. But the sort of surprise and delight, the things that aren't essential to survival, the ludic aspects. This is something that Meredith writes about of chance. The little laugh that we get out of something that we didn't expect. Might also be necessary for survival, finally, but we're not programmed for it, maybe.
Certainly the ludic dimension to existence, though, is nonetheless controlled, as we know, by rules. All play has some, there are always rules somewhere behind, lurking behind even the most innocuous or obvious examples of play, as Huizinga and Kaiwa have pointed out in their big studies of play. So even when you're looking for pure enjoyment, for pure pleasure, for pure let it all hang outness, there is a set of rules usually somewhere behind it all, it seems to me.
I think it's an important distinction between the experience of something and the ideas that go into its design. And that's true of art as in architecture. They are kind of two different things. And to produce the kind of free sense of play requires often tremendous control.
My comment, and I think I don't have a question, I have a comment, is on the order of where you are right now with the discussion. A couple of weeks ago, I heard an interview of the choreographer, whose name I can't remember, but he was John Cage's partner. And he talked about their deliberate lack of control in performance. So in this case, the combination of Cage's music and the dance. And that they would, in a certain sense, set up a rule for themselves that when they went out to perform, they didn't know what they were going to do. And that in many instances, they were relying on the reaction of their audience to give them feedback, so they kind of build on that feedback, if you will. But he also talked about how absolutely deadly frustrating that was for him as a dancer. He didn't talk about whether or not Cage was frustrated, but he was frustrated. And the great degree of frustration that created for the audience. And in my mind, it would seem like perhaps chance has gone away because we, the individual listening, observing, trying to construct, we don't want to deal with that chance. We become totally frustrated by it. And so maybe then our reaction is we try to build a framework around it, as this person down the front was suggesting, but that it's very hard to sustain chance in our human society. But I would love to hear your comments on that suggestion.
Agreed.
Yeah, I mean, all the art that's in the exhibit that we think of as being an important creation in this chance genre are all things that worked, that people want to talk about and look at, right? We don't see the 100 Ellsworth Kellys that he threw out. So, I mean,
Your point reminds me, though, of the question of revivals of certain works. I think of Samuel Beckett's early works, you know, thinking of Waiting for Godot, which I recently saw in New York, and I laughed through practically the whole play. I thought, you know, when this first came out, we were all talking about existential angst and this and that, and why are these people saying these random, crazy things? What does it all mean? And is this the end of the world? Is this the end of Western civilization? And now I listen to it, and it seems almost too contrived. The rules again, the rule of the game is somehow more obvious to me now, and so I just listen to Beckett's prose in general and laugh more than I cry.
no.
And I think that may be true as well. You think about the Commedia dell'arte, which is, you know, is created by stock figures, right? The mice or the whatever, the Joker, and yet even in that tradition, so that the rule was established, but there was a certain kind of spontaneity left, I think, to the actors themselves to play that role in whatever way they wanted to play that role. So, you know, it seems to me that we're talking about something that's really dialectic rather than, you know, all this or all that. There's really a kind of coming and going between the opposites of order and chaos, or randomness and systems. So maybe that's what you're, you know, ultimately getting to in your reflection.
It seems to me that you're right in principle, and that I mean, thinking about it in terms of music, if you had a system, a musical system in which all sounds are possible at any given time, there's no way of predicting what would happen next, and the system produces sort of as much information as it will. That's the theoretical definition of noise, right? If you're getting all possibilities equally available all the time, and there's no reason to choose among them, and there's no. And in music, what we do when we listen with attention is to draw some kind of connection from one event to the next, even if that connection is not determined by the composition or not determined with any reason by the composition. Even if it's a roll of the dice that determines it, that's still what we do when we listen. So I guess I'm agreeing with everyone else that there's this balance between being able to relate one thing to what came before and being able to have some surprise from time to time.
But didn't Cage want us to listen to the noise?
Yes. One of the great contradictions of Cage is that he insisted that what he was doing was training to listen to sounds as sounds in themselves. So the idea of a communicative principle or of structured relations between sounds was anathema to Cage. But he always hated Beethoven. He complained about Beethoven because Beethoven was trying to assert the kind of relationships and this sort of this powerful individual ego. And I always wondered if Cage was at all good at the thing that he was supposedly practicing, why he just couldn't turn that off and listen to Beethoven and just hear the sounds of the instruments as sounds and not as some kind of romantic discourse. But he never made it that far himself.
Anxiety of influence.
If random chance is being used as sort of fresh blood, was there a feeling that in either visual arts or music that there was a lack of fresh blood when these random approaches cropped up?
I think so, yeah. I think that often, from the Dadaists down to various movements of the 50s or 60s, there's this continual effort to recharge the avant-garde, and the chance is one of those strategies.
Yeah, it's the modernist stance itself that not only demands innovation, but it seems to demand a constantly increasing pace of innovation. So the moves that you had to make to avoid repeating what your predecessors had done were increasingly difficult over the course of the century.
Right, which might be one of the reasons why we said this moment of chance has passed, in a sense.
Yeah.
That you get that notion of the modernist avant-garde sort of pushing for constant innovation, sort of anti-conventions. When you get this postmodern moment with Roland Barthes, everybody's questioning the notion of originality and authenticity, and that it doesn't have that same kind of critical capacity necessarily.
I think I agree with that, but maybe one reason why chance is not that pertinent anymore would also be that there was always a moment where chance, as John pointed also out, was opposing rationality and also to a certain extent mechanization. If you look to the Tattling machine, that's a machine which undermines the machine. And so in the moment you basically, and I think Vasarely was the first, where you can write on a computer a random system, an aleatory system, chance itself is not, has lost, so to speak, because these rational systems, these machines, have taken over chance and the accident and the potential to criticize rationality. And that might be, maybe one of the problems as well. And I was wondering if the opposition between, rationality and accident doesn't really work anymore if other systems or other approaches like Mario Matt's system of the Fibonacci numbers, if that comes in, so that you don't have the tension anymore between the rational and the accidental, but that you look for something in between, like a mathematical system which doesn't seem to be mathematical. Just as an idea.
Yeah, a system based,
Yeah.
based not on the grid, but on an organic quality or an imputed organic quality, like the spiral.
It's pretty easy. It's like 1 + 1 is 2, 2 plus 4 is 3. You always take the last number and add 1.
But, you know, Le Corbusier's modular system, which he puts forward at the same time as the Sion group, is based on that. It's based on the Fibonacci series. And it's this idea of trying to create more human proportions instead of the kind of more rigid systems that were coming into place at that time. But again, it's very much a control system, really. And chance enters into it very little, I think.
Oh, no, I totally agree. That's why I said that this would be an alternative to accident or chance and total rationality.
Yeah.
Because there's this moment which doesn't add up to a logical.
Yeah.
It's a logical order, but it doesn't really look like it.
Right, exactly. That's right. It looks organic. That's the goal. Right. Yeah. And that's very much a contemporary goal.
Well, I feel kind of sad now after listening to you, realizing that the show Chance Aesthetics is not very important anymore. And I'd like a little antidote for that, really. And I'm thinking about my own interest in moving image media and the number of add-ons you get for your digital video editing processes, and that they encourage you so much experimentation that you still get the feeling that sometimes the art can make itself, and I think that's the kind of the idea behind the interest in Chance Aesthetics in the first place. I believe in maybe video art, at least it's still alive. And speaking of moving image, I'm trying to think back to a term maybe past the underground film movement, maybe in the early 70s, when we talked about something called structuralism. And wasn't structuralism actually a move away from structure, and it was just providing a structure to contain a sort of randomness that then could be applied? I wonder if anybody knows about that movement anymore, because I never could quite understand it, but now I think I do.
I could respond really quickly to the comment about structuralism. Julia Kristeva once said that structuralism has within its essence the seeds of its own destruction. That within structuralism, there's already post-structuralism. Within semiology, there is what you call a semioclasty. In other words, there's always this opposite force there inside of its origin, as it were. So I think that's one thing one can say. But that just points to this business about the dialectic that I mentioned a few minutes ago. It doesn't seem to me that one can ever talk about pure structuralism or pure post-structuralism or pure modernism or pure postmodernism at all. In fact, the reason these terms exist is so that we have extremes between which we can talk about everything else, everything that's real and everything that we can actually understand. So these in the sense these poles are precisely the kinds of rules of the game too that will seem to lie behind any ludic activity, that whether it be art or music or architecture or literature.
Those structures provide the unique personality of whatever that randomness is that you're working with.
Or bring them out.
Yes.
Perhaps give relief to them somehow. Put them in relief.
Thank you.
If you're really hoping for a note of optimism, I could say that what's happened in music, I think, is that we're past the point where many people would attribute any particular aesthetic value to indeterminacy or chance or its related phenomena for its own sake. But the things that in some sense work have just sort of been subsumed into the working methods of those composers who are interested or musicians who are interested. So you no longer join one school or another. You just sort of use these things if they serve your purposes, so that they've been suffused into the way we think about music in a way that's more or less seamless now.
I'd say also in response to your talking about how standard, your standard computer that you get these days has video editing software and a million different buttons to push. It might not be random in what you produce in the sense that those tools have been prescribed by somebody who made that software. But what seems to be a real source of lifeblood and creative energy now is the fact that when you give 5 billion people those computers and they each push buttons randomly, you get stuff that gets a million hits on YouTube. Right? So there's this sort of crowdsourcing as a way of getting energy and fresh blood in. And that's from everything from aesthetic and endeavors to things like, it used to be that everybody was racing to build the biggest computer. Now we just plug 5,000 computers together. We don't worry about how big they are. We get the same work done. So there's a sort of using the mob as a way to produce things in a way that it used to be you had to go to the phone book and get the numbers out and to have a random source of stuff. But now we're so connected you can just use people.
All right, if there's no more questions, it's time for a reception over at the museum, so I invite you all to come over and check out the show. I want to thank everybody on the panel for a great discussion. And one announcement, the next public program in relationship to this exhibition is on October 7th, is that right, Bruce? Okay, there's a chance concert and at the 560 building. It starts at 6:30. We'll be having a performance of John Cage Agrees with the Changes, Terry Riley's Incy, and a new composition in collaboration between the music department and the performing arts department. And Bruce will be introducing all of the program that evening.